she moved into a nursing home, thinking she would finally be safe. But one evening, she noticed a strange sofa in the common room. And when she heard a click coming from inside it at night, she realized it wasn't just a piece of furniture. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The day Martha Ellens lost her home was the day the world seemed to sigh and fold inward, as if the very walls of her life had grown tired of holding themselves upright. The small yellow house at the end of Willow Street, the one she and her husband had painted together 43 years ago, stood bare and stripped. All the curtains were gone, the kitchen shelves were empty, even the faint scent of cinnamon. Her husband's favorite had faded, leaving behind the sterile smell of cardboard boxes and old varnish. Martha stood in the living room, her fingers lightly touching the armrest of the sofa they had chosen as newlyweds. The fabric was worn, but it had molded to their lives, holding the imprint of decades. She wanted desperately to take it with her, but the social worker's gentle explanation reminded her that the assisted living facility had its own furniture, and there was no way to fit something so large into her assigned room. She folded the old knitted plaid one of the few things the facility allowed her to bring, and placed it carefully into her bag. It felt like gathering ashes of a former life. When the moving van arrived, she climbed into the back seat with the slow, deliberate movement of someone stepping into an irreversible future. As the vehicle pulled away, she watched the house shrink until it was just a pale shape in the afternoon light. Her throat tightened, and she blinked slowly, as if refusing to allow tears to claim this moment. The world had already taken enough from her without taking her dignity too. The drive to the facility was quiet, the hum of the road filling the silence between her thoughts. She kept her hands folded over her bag, feeling the texture of the plaid beneath her palms. Every bump on the road felt like a punctuation mark. You're leaving. You're leaving. You're leaving. By the time the van turned down a narrow street lined with trimmed hedges and old oak trees, Martha felt the familiar weariness that came not from age, but from surrender. The sign in front of the building read, "Seaver's House," in cheerful blue letters that tried too hard to suggest warmth. The building itself was 3 stories tall, with aging beige siding and a broad ramp leading to the entrance. It didn't look unkind, exactly. Just tired, as though it had spent too many years pretending to be more than it was. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant, mixed with the persistent aroma of boiled vegetables. Soft instrumental music trickled through ceiling speakers, looping the same few notes with uncanny repetition. The receptionist greeted her with a wide smile, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Welcome, Mrs. Ellens. We're happy to have you here," she said brightly, handing Martha a clipboard full of forms she knew she was too tired to read. As the receptionist talked, Martha took in the space around her. The walls were painted a washed-out peach color, and the lighting was dim enough to blur imperfections. Several residents sat in armchairs along the wall, their gazes blank or drifting. Some stared at their hands, others at the floor. None looked like people who felt welcome anywhere. A nurse named Jessica was assigned to show her around. The young woman's voice was soft, but practiced, the tone of someone who had repeated the same tour hundreds of times. "Here's the dining room. Meals are served 3 times a day, with snacks in between. Your medications will be given at scheduled times by staff only. And this is your room. Let us know if you need anything." The room was small, barely enough space for a bed, a nightstand, and a narrow wardrobe. The mattress had a slight dip in the middle, as though countless bodies had lain there, sinking deeper with each passing year. A single window looked out onto a courtyard with a tired-looking fountain that no longer ran. Martha set her bag down and gently spread the plaid across the foot of the bed, smoothing it as though it were fragile. Jessica watched her for a moment and then smiled politely. "Dinner is in an hour. If you'd like to rest, that's perfectly fine." but rest was the last thing Martha could imagine. She stepped into the hallway, leaning lightly on the rail that lined the wall, and walked toward the sound of muffled voices. The residents she passed moved with a slow, shuffling gait, like people trudging through deep snow. Some offered tentative smiles. Others seemed lost in their own worlds. In the common lounge, a large television played an old rerun show at a low volume. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing the screen, except for one object that immediately drew Martha's eyes. There, positioned directly across from the television, stood a massive sofa. It was strangely out of place, too new and too luxurious for the modest facility. Its deep olive gray upholstery contrasted sharply with the faded carpet beneath it. The cushions sat in perfect alignment, almost unnaturally symmetrical, as if someone adjusted them meticulously and often. Martha slowed her pace, sensing something amiss. The sofa didn't match the rest of the room's age or wear. Everything else looked worn down from years of use. The sofa looked deliberate, intentional, as if someone had chosen it to be the centerpiece of the room. She stepped closer and ran her fingertip along the fabric. It felt firmer than she expected. Cold, even. She pressed down slightly on one of the cushions and felt a subtle tension beneath the surface. A resistance that reminded her not of foam, but of something mechanical. Her skin prickled. She pulled her hand back. A man sitting in a recliner nearby glanced at her before looking quickly away. When Martha turned toward him, he gave a small shake of his head, almost imperceptible. She wasn't sure whether it was meant as a warning or just the response of someone used to minding his own business. She left the room before she could decide. That night, she lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The building made soft, familiar noises, distant footsteps, the beep of a machine, the faint hum of air vents. But beneath these sounds was something else, something she couldn't name. Around midnight, a soft click echoed from the hallway, sharp enough to make her sit up. It reminded her of the sound a camera made when turning on. She rose slowly, her joints stiff but her mind alert, and walked to the door. The hallway was empty. She peered toward the lounge, and in the faint glow spilling from the television screen, she saw a dark silhouette. The sofa, unmoving, its shape heavy and watchful. She closed the door, but sleep never came. In the morning, she tried to convince herself she had simply imagined things, the product of exhaustion and emotional upheaval. But when she passed through the lounge on her way to breakfast, she immediately noticed something wrong. The sofa was positioned at a different angle than the previous evening, not by much, but enough for someone with a careful eye to see. The cushions were smoothed more precisely than she remembered, as though someone had passed their hands along them with obsessive care. A caretaker approached her from behind, startling her slightly. "You're up early, Mrs. Ellens. Everything all right?" Martha nodded, hiding her discomfort. She watched the woman glance at the sofa. Not casually, but quickly, with something like caution. As Martha sat down for breakfast, she overheard murmured voices at the next table. "The new one won't last long," a thin woman whispered to her seatmate. "They all stop asking questions eventually." Later that afternoon, after wandering aimlessly through the hallways to avoid sitting alone in her room, Martha returned to the lounge. The television played softly, and a few residents sat in the recliners, their eyes on the screen but unfocused, as though their minds were elsewhere entirely. The sofa stood in its usual place. One man, bent and frail, approached it, paused, and then slowly lowered himself onto the far left cushion. His face relaxed instantly, his shoulders sinking. Within moments, his eyes fluttered shut. Martha watched, uneasy, as his chest rose and fell in a strangely measured rhythm, too slow, too even, as if he were breathing in time with something that wasn't his own body. After a minute, He opened his eyes and stared straight ahead, expression blank, as though whatever thoughts he possessed had been drained. Martha backed away, her heartbeat quickening. A voice to her left made her jump. "Don't sit there." She turned to see the same man from earlier, the one who had shaken his head. A former soldier, perhaps, judging by his posture. His voice was hoarse, but steady. "It takes something from you," he whispered. "Bit by bit." Before she could ask what he meant, a caretaker approached and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Harris, time for your medication." His expression flattened instantly, and he followed the caretaker without resistance. Martha watched him go, feeling both pity and dread spreading through her chest. For the rest of the day, she couldn't shake the sense that the sofa was more than a simple piece of furniture. It seemed to pull at the room, drawing attention without moving, watching without eyes. Whenever she walked past the doorway, she found herself unwilling to enter the lounge. She avoided it entirely during dinner. But later that night, as she sat on her bed, trying to read her old book, one she had nearly memorized, she heard the sound again. A click, a soft electric hum. She froze, listening. Then came a faint whir. She felt the air shift, like someone exhaling behind her. A memory rose unbidden in her mind, the sensation of that strange vibration under the sofa's cushion. She stood, walked to the doorway, and peered out. The hallway lights cast a dim, yellow glow. The lounge beyond looked empty, but she sensed something alive in the room, a presence that didn't belong to any living person. She closed her door slowly and pressed her back against it, gripping her arms tightly. She had lost her home, her freedom, her familiarity with the world. But she suddenly understood. She had also lost something else. Something she didn't dare define yet. A sense of safety. A sense that the world wasn't watching her with cold, unseen eyes. She didn't know what the sofa was, or why it filled her with such dread. But she knew one thing without doubt. Something in this place was wrong, and whatever it was, it had already noticed her. This realization stayed with her long after the noises subsided and the building fell silent, whispering to her through the darkness like a warning. She couldn't ignore it. And though she didn't yet know it, the first threads of a truth far darker than her fears had already begun to unravel around her. The fear that had crept into Martha's mind during her first nights at Seaver's house did not vanish with daylight. Instead, it settled deeper, becoming a kind of quiet, persistent pulse beneath everything she did. Each morning she awoke with the same thought burning in her mind. The sofa was not just a piece of furniture. Something in that room was alive in a way that had nothing to do with breath or heartbeat, and everything to do with intent. She avoided the lounge for most of the following day. She lingered in the dining hall longer than necessary, picking at her breakfast until the oatmeal cooled into an unappealing paste. She took slow walks around the narrow courtyard, relying on the small wooden railings for balance. She even sat through a mindful stretching class arranged by one of the younger caregivers, her movements stiff and minimal, but her eyes always drifting to the door, checking who came and went. Anything to avoid passing that heavy green sofa again. But avoidance could hold her only so long. After dinner, as she walked toward her room, she paused outside the lounge. The lights were dimmed, as they always were in the evenings, creating deep pools of shadow along the walls. The television chattered softly with the familiar cadence of a sitcom laugh track. There were only 2 residents inside, both seated in recliners, both so still they might have been carved from wax. Martha felt the pull of the sofa before she even stepped in. It was as if the room itself leaned slightly in its direction, as if the shadows around it deepened to draw attention to its presence. She forced her gaze upward toward the television, pretending not to notice the object dominating the room. But she couldn't ignore the pressure in her chest, an awareness she had never felt before in her long, sensible life. Something was watching. It wasn't merely paranoia, nor the frailty of aging. This was different. It was deliberate. She walked past the doorway cautiously, but curiosity tugged at her heels. Her steps slowed. She turned her head just enough to catch a glimpse of the cushions. They looked pristine, untouched. Perfect. Too perfect. Last night, an old man had fallen asleep on the left cushion. She had seen his head slump sideways, his face sinking into the fabric. Yet now the cushion was uncreased, smoothed flat with meticulous precision. She stared, unsettled by how freshly arranged it looked, as though someone had been adjusting it every hour. That night, sleep refused to come. She tossed in her narrow bed, the sheets rustling loudly in the quiet room. Every creak of the hallway, every shuffle of distant steps drew her attention. She tried reading her book again, but the words blurred into restless impressions. She closed it with a trembling sigh. She felt watched, though she was alone. She felt listened to, though she made no sound. Around 2 a.m, she heard it again. A soft click, unmistakable. A mechanical murmur, as though something small and hidden had powered on. It came from the direction of the lounge. She sat upright, her breath caught in her throat. The sound had the same quality as the previous nights, like a tiny lens opening, a switch sliding into place. Gathering her courage, she slipped out of her room, tightening her cardigan around her shoulders as if it could offer protection. The hallway was dim and quiet. At the far end, a faint glow spilled from the lounge. Martha moved slowly, her slippers soundless against the linoleum floor. She paused at the threshold, holding her breath. The sofa sat in the same place. But something had changed. The faint mesh of the upholstery reflected the television light in a way she had not seen before. Too bright, too clean. It was as if the fabric had been polished. She stepped inside, drawn in despite her fear. The 2 residents who had been here earlier were gone. The room was empty. Only the sofa remained in the center, proud and silent. As she approached it, the hairs on her arms lifted. A wave of coldness washed across her, like stepping into the shadow of a mountain. She leaned closer, squinting, and noticed a faint irregularity along one of the seams on the back panel, almost imperceptible. She traced it with her fingertip and felt a slight scratch beneath the fabric. Something metallic. She pressed more firmly, and a tiny shard of metal dislodged, catching faintly in the dim light. The piece was sharp, like a shaving from a drill bit. Her pulse quickened. Someone had tampered with the sofa. Not yesterday. Not last week. Recently. Martha pulled her hand back sharply. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she backed away from the looming piece of furniture. She scanned the room quickly, feeling exposed. And then she heard footsteps. She fled before she could lose her nerve, darting into the hallway and slipping into the nearest shadowed corner. The footsteps drew nearer, steady, unhurried. A night orderly walked past with a clipboard, his eyes oddly blank. Martha held her breath until he disappeared around the corner. When she finally crept back into her room, her hands were shaking so violently she had to sit down on the bed to steady them. She told herself she would sleep. She told herself it was all coincidence, but she knew better. The next morning over breakfast, she cautiously mentioned the sofa to a caregiver, phrasing her concern as lightly as she could. "That big sofa in the lounge," she said, stirring her tea. "It's unusual, isn't it?" The caregiver's expression hardened instantly, though her mouth still formed a polite smile. "Oh, that old thing. It's perfectly safe. Nothing to worry about." The tone was sharp, warning, as if Martha had stepped somewhere she wasn't meant to tread. Shortly afterward, she was called to the medical office. The doctor, A thin man with cold eyes framed by wire-rimmed glasses insisted she take new medication. "It will help with sleep," he said, pushing the small paper cup toward her. But Martha had not mentioned sleep issues. She stared at the pills, and a prickling feeling crept into her spine. She feigned swallowing them, letting them dissolve in a tissue when he briefly turned his head. As she left the office, she nearly collided with an elderly man leaning against the wall. His posture was slumped, but his eyes were alert. It was the same man from the lounge, the one who had warned her not to sit on the sofa. He gave her a faint nod and whispered, "Don't let them silence you." Before she could respond, a nurse appeared and ushered him away, placing a guiding hand at his back. He stiffened slightly at her touch, as if conditioned to obey. The rest of the day felt different, darker. She felt eyes on her everywhere she walked. Conversations hushed when she approached. A sense of tightening pressure surrounded her, the invisible walls of the place closing in with each passing hour. But fate, perhaps, had other plans for her. Just before dinner, she sat on a bench near the courtyard, trying to savor what little quiet she could. She felt someone take a seat beside her. At first, she assumed it was another wandering resident. But when she turned her head, she met the keen, calculating gaze of a tall man with silver hair and careful movements. "My name is Thomas," he said quietly. "You need to be careful." Martha's first instinct was to deny everything, to retreat into the shell of an obedient resident. But something in the man's eyes, a mixture of intelligence and urgency, disarmed her. He continued, keeping his voice low. "I've seen you watching the sofa, and I know what you found last night. The metal shard." Martha's breath caught. "How did you—" "I've been watching too," he said simply. "Longer than you." She looked away, her heart pounding. "You're not imagining it," he said softly. "There are sensors inside it. Cameras, microphones, maybe more. They're installed with precision, far too much precision for this place." She swallowed hard. "Why? Why would they do that?" Before Thomas could answer, a woman with a kind, lined face approached them. She wore a pale blue sweater and carried herself with the practiced calm of someone who had spent her life caring for others. "That's enough for now," she said gently but firmly. "Too many ears around here. My name is Sarah. I used to be a nurse. Not here. Somewhere respectable." Her eyes flicked toward the building behind them. "Let's talk later." That night, the three of them met in a quiet, unused hallway near the storage closet. Thomas leaned heavily on his cane, but his hands worked with quick, precise movements. He produced a small flashlight and directed its beam along the back of the sofa's inner frame in the lounge. "I've traced some of the wiring," he murmured. "It's not plugged into anything you can see. It goes into the wall." Sarah added, her voice tense. "Medical files go missing. People sign things they don't remember signing. Decisions get made in their name. And some residents disappear." Martha felt a cold weight settle in her chest. She had known something was wrong, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real. "What do we do?" she asked in a whisper. Thomas lifted his gaze toward hers. "We find out where the wires lead." That night, they waited until the halls were quiet. The television buzzed faintly in the lounge, casting flickering light across the walls. Martha stood watch by the doorway, while Thomas crouched near the baseboards, following the nearly invisible wire with the small beam of his light. Sarah monitored the hallway, ready to warn them if anyone approached. The wire entered a vent, passed behind a painting, and disappeared behind a locked storage door. "This is it," Thomas whispered. The door had a new electronic lock, its surface shiny and out of place in the older building. Thomas studied it with intense concentration, then pressed 2 fingers to its underside. There was a faint click. "How did you do that?" Martha whispered. "Old habits," Thomas said simply. I used to work with electronics." They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. The room was cluttered with broken wheelchairs, rusted walkers, and stacks of dusty supplies. But the far wall was strange, a set of shelves pushed awkwardly against it, as though concealing something. Martha's heart thudded loudly in her chest as Thomas and Sarah pushed the shelves aside. Behind them was another door, smaller, hidden. Even from where Martha stood, she felt the shift in the air, the sense that they were about to cross an invisible threshold into something forbidden. When Thomas slowly turned the handle and opened the hidden door, a faint, cold breath of air met them, tinged with the sterile smell of electronics. Something strobed faintly in the darkness beyond, monitors, rows of them. And in that moment, Martha understood. The facility didn't simply watch the residents. It listened. It recorded. It studied. Her voice trembled when she finally whispered, "What is this place?" Thomas looked grim. "A place where we're not people," he said. "We're data." Martha stared into the glowing blue light, feeling the truth settle over her like a shroud. She had feared a sofa. But this was something much larger, much darker, and they had only just begun to uncover it. The air inside the hidden space felt colder than the corridor behind them, as if the room itself existed at a different temperature, a different pulse, a different kind of life. Martha stood frozen on the threshold, while Thomas stepped cautiously inside, his cane tapping softly against the concrete floor. Sarah followed, her breath catching as her eyes adjusted to the glow of countless screens lining the walls. Martha's heart hammered loudly in her ears, each beat a reminder that she did not belong here, that she was crossing a boundary meant to remain unseen. But she forced herself forward. She needed to understand. She needed to see what had been hidden in the shadows of Seaver's house. The monitors hummed quietly, each displaying a different view. Resident rooms, hallways, the cafeteria, the courtyard. Every corner of the facility was visible from here, as if the building were made of glass, and the people living inside were no more than silhouettes in a dollhouse. On some screens, small red dots pulsed faintly at the corner's recording indicators. Martha felt her stomach twist. She had suspected cameras, but she had never imagined anything like this. Thomas leaned closer to a screen and pointed to a small numeric overlay in the corner. It flickered subtly, scrolling through data points, heart rate, stress markers, facial recognition tags. Martha's mind struggled to make sense of it. "They're monitoring more than movement," he murmured. "They're reading reactions, emotions, physiological responses. It's all being logged." His voice trembled not from frailty, but from anger. Sarah walked toward a metal shelving unit stacked with folders, wires, flash drives, and brown envelopes. She picked up one of the folders with gentle, trembling fingers. Inside were pages filled with charts, signatures, time stamps, and assessments. At the top of the first page was a name Martha recognized, Mr. Harris, the man who had warned her about the sofa. Her hands clenched around her cardigan. Sarah flipped through the pages, her brows knitting tighter with every line. "They've documented everything," she whispered. "Private conversations, medications, changes in behavior, notes about when he was most pliable." She shook her head, a soft, horrified sound escaping her throat. "This isn't care. This is profiling." Martha turned toward another monitor, her breath catching when she saw the familiar dim outline of her own room. The tiny window, the bed, the nightstand, all illuminated in a cold, colorless frame. Earlier that evening, she had been sitting on the bed brushing her hair, unaware she was being watched. Now the screen showed another view. The lounge, empty except for the sofa standing alone like a sentinel. The camera was angled in such a way that the sofa filled the center of the image, as if it were the subject of the observation rather than the people around it. Martha stepped closer, unable to tear her gaze away. Thomas adjusted his glasses and traced the wire they had followed earlier. It ran into a black metal box beneath one of the desks, blinking with steady green lights. "This is the hub," he said quietly. "Every feed routes through here. They're storing all of it." He knelt, examining the ports and switches with an expert's eye. "Some of these wires don't connect to internal networks. They're transmitting." He paused, looking up, his face grim. "This isn't just for the facility's use. Someone outside is receiving these files." Martha felt the floor sway slightly beneath her feet. Someone outside. Someone bigger. She glanced back at the shelves, noticing a small wooden box placed among the electronics. It seemed out of place, handcrafted, old-fashioned. She opened it cautiously and found photographs inside. They were glossy, taken at close range, showing residents at vulnerable moments, sleeping, crying, receiving medication, staring blankly into the distance. One photo made her gasp. It showed an elderly woman, frail and trembling, sitting on the sofa. A tiny timestamp glowed at the bottom. Martha flipped the picture. On the back, written in small, neat handwriting, were the words, "Cognitive compliance achieved." Her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the photo. Sarah hurried to her side, taking the stack of images with wide eyes. "They're breaking people," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They're wearing them down, stripping them of independence, and then documenting the results." The words sliced Martha's heart open. This was worse than she had feared, worse than any nightmare she could have imagined. People like her, people who had worked, loved, lived full lives, were being treated like experiments. Suddenly, a sharp memory surged through her mind. The old man in the recliner, the way he had fallen asleep instantly after sinking into the sofa, his face slack and hollow. She remembered how his breath had changed, too even, too regulated. The thought made her skin crawl. She turned to Thomas. "Can they influence people? Through the sofa? Is that possible?" The question sounded absurd, yet nothing seemed absurd anymore. Thomas hesitated. "There are pressure sensors, heart rate sensors, microphones. If they had vibrational or audio components built in low-frequency emissions, they could manipulate mood or confuse cognitive function. It's not impossible." He cast a dark glance toward the monitors, especially in older adults, especially those already weakened. Martha's chest tightened. She sank into a nearby chair, gripping the edge of the desk to steady herself. "So, when we sit there," her voice faltered, "we change." Thomas rested a hand on her shoulder with something like sorrow. "Yes." The truth settled over her in a suffocating cloud. She had come to Seaver's house because she had nowhere else to go, because she believed she would at least be safe. But this place had never been designed for safety. It was designed for exploitation, for control, for theft. Sarah placed the stack of photographs back in the box, her hands shaking. "We need evidence," she said. "Real evidence. Something we can take out of here." Thomas nodded and pointed to the main computer. "We can download some of the files, but we have to move quickly. These systems auto-refresh and purge data at intervals. I've seen places like this before." Martha raised her head sharply. "You have?" Thomas looked at her with a mixture of shame and resolve. "In my old job, I installed surveillance equipment for private firms. I didn't ask questions then. But I recognized the setup. This wasn't made by amateurs." His eyes hardened. "This was made by professionals." Sarah knelt beside him. "Then you know how to copy the files?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, but we'll need a flash drive, and we'll need time." Time. something they had less and less of with every passing minute. Martha stood, a surge of determination pushing her forward. Then let's get what we need, before someone comes. As they worked, the room buzzed with quiet urgency. Thomas navigated through folders and directories with surprising speed, copying audio logs, video feeds, behavioral charts. Sarah photographed documents with her phone, muttering that she wished she had more battery. Martha searched through the shelves, uncovering one horrifying file after another. Lists of priority residents, charts mapping financial assets, documents outlining family connections, and, most horrifying of all, a list of individuals marked potential transition, each followed by a date. The most recent date was yesterday. The name beside it was one she recognized. Harry. Her breath shuddered. The room felt suddenly too small. She clutched the paper, unable to believe it. Harry had known. He had tried to warn her. And now, he was gone. Before she could speak, a sound sliced through the air, a faint creak of footsteps approaching from the hallway. Not hurried, not panicked. Slow. Intentional. Someone was coming. The three of them froze. Thomas clicked off the monitors. Sarah switched off her flashlight. The room plunged into thick, suffocating semi-darkness, lit only by the faint glow of standby lights on the machinery. Martha's heart thudded violently, each beat echoing in her skull. The footsteps came closer, stopping just outside the hidden door. A hand brushed the surface of the door lightly, as though testing the handle. Martha held her breath, gripping the wooden box of photographs tightly. The silence stretched thin. Then, mercifully, a voice echoed from farther down the hallway. Another nurse calling out, "Check the west wing, will you?" The person outside hesitated, then footsteps retreated slowly. Only when the sound faded completely did Thomas release a shaky breath. "We have to go," he mouthed. They slipped out of the room one by one, careful not to disturb the shelves when they closed the hidden door behind them. Every sound echoed too loudly in Martha's ears as they crept back through the storage room and into the hallway. For a moment, Martha feared they would run into someone, that their escape would fall apart at the last second. But the corridor was empty, dim, harmless-looking, deceptively so. Back in the shadows of the abandoned hallway where they had first met, Thomas lifted the flash drive, now heavy with damning evidence. "This is enough," he said. "More than enough." Sarah nodded, though her face was pale. "We can't stay here. They'll know someone accessed the system. They'll come looking. You've seen how they act when a resident asks questions." Martha knew she was right. She felt the weight of what she had seen pressing into her bones. She thought of the photographs, the recordings, the cold precision of the monitoring equipment. She thought of Harry's last warning, of the eerie stillness that had overtaken so many of the residents, of the way the sofas seemed to watch and feed on the vulnerability of the people who trusted this place to care for them. She lifted her chin, a spark of fierce resolve igniting in her chest. "Then we get this out," she said with quiet strength. "We take it to the police. We expose them." Her voice didn't sound like that of a frail elderly woman. It sounded like someone who had spent a lifetime fighting for her own dignity and was now ready to fight for the dignity of others. Thomas gave a slow nod. "But we must be strategic. If we go too early, they'll stop us. If we wait too long, they may destroy the evidence or remove us." He exchanged a heavy glance with Sarah. "We'll leave before dawn, when the shift changes and fewer night staff are watching." Martha felt the exhaustion of the day sink into her limbs, but she also felt something else. Clarity. Purpose. For the first time since arriving at Seaver's house, she felt like she had regained a part of herself that she thought had been buried with the sale of her home. As they parted ways to avoid suspicion, Martha paused and looked back at the corridor they had just come from. The glow from the hidden room had vanished completely, like the eye of some monstrous creature slowly shutting. But she knew it was still there, behind the wall, still watching, still listening, still waiting for its next victim. She returned to her room silently, each step planting her deeper into a truth she could no longer unsee. When she closed her door and leaned against it, she let herself breathe for the first time in hours. The darkness of the room felt different now, not oppressive, but honest. At least here, she knew she was alone. For the moment. She walked to the window and pulled back the curtain slightly. The courtyard lights flickered below, casting long shadows across the empty benches. Somewhere out there, Harry had spent his final days, torn between fear and rebellion. She whispered a promise into the stillness. "I won't let them erase you." Then she closed the curtain and sat on the bed, hands folded tightly in her lap. The plan for Dawn formed clearly in her mind. They had evidence. They had allies. They had purpose. And now, they had something the facility had not accounted for, a reason to fight. Outside her room, faintly, distantly, came the barely audible click of a camera lens turning, somewhere inside the walls. But for the first time, Martha did not shrink from it. She stared into the darkness with calm, unyielding resolve. Tomorrow, everything would change. Dawn did not arrive gently at Seaver's house. It crept in reluctantly, carrying with it a dull, gray light that clung to the walls like damp fog. The sun had not yet risen above the tree line when Martha opened her eyes. She had not truly slept. She had drifted in and out of restless, thin dreams that dissolved the moment she tried to recall them. Her mind was too alert, too aware, too ready. Today was not like other days. Today was the day she would leave this place, or try to, and the knowledge of it sent a pulse of energy through her aging limbs. She pushed herself up slowly, listening to the building breathe around her. The hallway outside was quiet. Too quiet. Usually, by this hour, caregivers began their rounds, carts rolling, voices murmuring soft greetings, the first clatter of breakfast trays stacking in the dining hall. But this morning, the silence stretched out, taut and waiting. Martha dressed quickly, her fingers trembling slightly as she buttoned her sweater. She had grabbed only the essentials: her ID card, her old purse, and the folded paper she had hidden beneath her mattress, copies of the photographs she and Sarah had found, the pages detailing compliance metrics, the list of residents marked for transition. She tucked them into the lining of her bag, where she hoped no one would think to search. She stepped cautiously into the hallway. Her feet made almost no sound on the linoleum floor as she moved toward the courtyard door, the place where she and the others had agreed to meet. The corridor lights flickered overhead, blinking weakly as though struggling to stay awake. When she reached the corner, she saw a shadow move. Her heart shot into her throat until Thomas stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked even paler than usual, the bluish morning light hollowing out the lines in his face, but his eyes were sharp. "You're early," he whispered. "I couldn't sleep," Martha replied, her voice barely audible. "Neither could I." His fingers tightened on the handle of his cane. "Sarah should be here soon. Her night shift ended an hour ago." They waited together in fragile silence. A faint metallic rattle echoed somewhere down the corridor, a cart being moved, perhaps, though the sound felt too deliberate. Martha fought the urge to glance over her shoulder. At last, quick footsteps approached. Sarah appeared from the opposite end of the hallway, her hair disheveled, her uniform jacket buttoned incorrectly, as though she had dressed in a hurry. She clutched a small tote bag pressed tightly against her chest. When she reached them, she exhaled shakily. "We don't have much time," she whispered. Shift change is happening early today. I heard 2 supervisors talking. They've been alerted that something in the system didn't match the logs. They're checking rooms." She looked at Martha with fear shadowing her expression. Your room was on the list. A cold wave swept through Martha. Did they go inside? Not yet, but they will. Thomas stepped closer. Then we need to leave. Now. They moved quickly through the hallway, avoiding the brighter corridors in favor of those still dim from the night's power-saving cycle. Every step felt heavy with danger. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence. When they reached the exit near the courtyard, Thomas paused and pulled a flash drive from his pocket, showing it just long enough for both women to see. "This is everything," he whispered. "The recordings, the files, the monitoring logs, the list." Sarah reached out and touched his arm gently. "Then we can't lose it." They slipped through the courtyard door. The morning air hit them with unexpected sharpness, cold enough to sting. The sky overhead was washed in muted colors, pale blue and gray merging into one another. The courtyard was empty, the benches wet with dew, the small garden plot dark and still. The only sound was the distant chirp of waking birds, until a faint beep echoed behind them. Sarah froze. "The door," she whispered. "It logs entries." "Move," Thomas urged. They walked briskly toward the side gate that led to the parking lot. It was the closest exit, and Sarah had arranged for a cab to wait just beyond the fence. But as they approached the gate, Martha felt a tremor in her chest. A figure stood by the fence, tall, motionless, dressed in the dark blue uniform of the night staff. His back was turned, but something about his posture sent a ripple of dread through her. Thomas signaled for them to slow. Sarah whispered, "That's Jacobs. He never leaves that post. We'll have to go another way." "No," Thomas said quietly. "We go past him. If we turn around now, it looks suspicious." Martha's breath trembled. She had not wanted confrontation, not at her age, not in her condition. But there was no turning back. They approached the gate as casually as they could, though her pulse beat wildly at her temples. Jacobs turned when they were only a few steps away. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes swept over them with clinical precision, lingering a moment too long on Thomas's bag, then on Martha's purse. "Going out?" he asked, his voice strangely flat. Sarah stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Dr. Kellerman asked us to bring something to the front desk. He needed forms checked this morning." Jacobs blinked slowly. "Forms," he echoed. "Yes," Sarah said lightly. "The insurance packets." He continued to stare at them, making no move to open the gate. For a moment, Martha feared he would call for backup. Then, without warning, he reached for the latch and pulled it open. The metal creaked loudly. "Be quick," he said. They slipped through before he changed his mind. The parking lot lay ahead of them, empty and silent, except for a single cab idling near the far corner. A plume of exhaust curled from its tailpipe like steam from a kettle. Their path was clear. Martha felt her knees weaken with relief, but they had taken only a few steps when the overhead speaker system crackled to life behind them. A woman's voice filled the courtyard, cold and clipped. "Attention staff. All personnel report for an emergency resident check. All unauthorized exits are temporarily suspended." Jacobs turned instantly. His expression sharpened. "Stop." But Thomas grabbed Martha's hand. "Run." They moved as fast as their aging bodies allowed, the gravel crunching beneath their feet with urgent intensity. The cab driver stepped out, startled, but Sarah waved frantically. "Please, get the doors open," Jacobs shouted behind them, but they didn't look back. The cab doors clicked open, and the 3 of them climbed inside. The driver stared at them with confusion. "Everything all right?" "Drive," Thomas gasped. "Don't stop." The cab shot forward just as another uniformed staff member appeared at the edge of the lot. The driver hesitated, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Should I be worried?" "Yes," Sarah said bluntly. "Just go." The facility shrank behind them as the road curved away. Trees blurred past the windows, their branches bowing in the cold wind. For a moment, no one spoke. Martha held her purse tightly against her chest, feeling the stiff edges of the concealed documents pressing against the fabric. Only when they reached the main road did she finally let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for hours. Thomas sagged back in his seat, rubbing his forehead. "We made it." Sarah exhaled shakily. "For now." The cab driver looked at them again, clearly unsettled. "Where am I taking you?" "To the police station," Thomas said. But when they arrived, the building's front lot was empty, except for 2 dark sedans. Martha felt her stomach twist. Something was wrong. She stepped out cautiously, clutching her purse, and approached the glass doors. Inside, 2 officers stood behind the counter, speaking in low voices with a woman in a gray suit. The woman turned, her gaze sharp, controlled. Their eyes met. Martha froze. She recognized the woman. It was the administrative director of Seaver's house. Her breath vanished. She whispered, "They got here first." Thomas reached them, his face paling as he saw the woman step forward. "Good morning," she said, her tone smooth. "We've been expecting you." Sarah flinched. "How?" "The moment you accessed the restricted system," the director replied. "We were alerted. We take breaches of resident safety very seriously." Martha felt heat flood her face. "Safety?" she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Is that what you call it?" The director smiled, a small, cold smile. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding. These are confidential medical systems, not criminal ones. You've stolen protected files, and that is an offense we cannot ignore." One of the officers stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his belt. "We'll need you all to come inside." Panic surged through Martha like a wave. They were trapped, outmaneuvered. She grasped Thomas's sleeve, searching frantically for another way. But then she noticed something. Through the glass wall to the right of the entrance, a group of officers sat discussing something urgently around a table. On that table was a file she recognized. The director had not yet claimed it, and none of the officers had opened it. The system hadn't transmitted everything. Thomas saw it too. He whispered, "We still have a chance." Sarah stepped forward, her voice rising before Martha could stop her. "You have no right to silence us." Her eyes burned with fury. "We know what you've been doing." The director's smile flickered. "What we've been doing is caring for the elderly who cannot care for themselves. What you've done." But she was cut off by a voice behind her. "Ma'am," one of the detectives said, lifting the file from the table. "You need to see this." The director turned sharply. "That's facility property." "No," the detective corrected, scanning the first page, his expression shifting. "This is a report of unauthorized surveillance, and it appears to involve state violations." The room fell still. The director's mask cracked for the first time. "Officer, you don't understand." "I understand enough," the detective interrupted, his tone turning cold. "You'll stay right where you are." The officers behind the counter straightened. The cab driver, still outside, watched with alarm. Martha felt her knees weaken, but this time from relief. Thomas slipped the flash drive into the detective's hand. "This," he said quietly, "is the rest." The detective nodded gravely. "We'll take it from here." Monitors, documents, logs, lists, everything they had risked their lives collecting was now in the hands of someone who could do something about it. Someone not tied to the facility's influence. Someone who could investigate. The director's voice sharpened with panic. "You're making a mistake. The residents are fragile. They imagine things." "The evidence says otherwise," the detective snapped. And in that moment, Martha felt the weight on her chest ease for the first time in weeks. They were believed. They were safe. Hours passed in a blur. Statements taken, questions asked, files reviewed, officers dispatched. The director was detained pending investigation. Staff from the facility were questioned. More officers arrived after discovering someone had attempted to remotely wipe the internal servers at Seaver's house, but Thomas's backup copies and the hidden drive they had uncovered secured everything. By afternoon, the three of them were allowed to sit together in a small side room. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, warm and gentle. Sarah leaned against the wall, exhausted but relieved. Thomas sat quietly with his hands folded on his cane. Martha lowered herself into a chair and looked at her companions, ordinary people, worn by age, burdened by loss, pushed aside by the world. And yet, they had done something extraordinary. They had stopped something monstrous. The detective returned with a tired but genuine smile. "We've confirmed enough already to begin shutting the operation down," he said. "You saved a lot of people today." Martha closed her eyes as a slow, warm wave washed over her. The fear in her chest had finally broken apart, like a storm clearing. When the officer left, the room fell into peaceful silence. Thomas turned to Martha and gave her a faint, grateful smile. "You started this," he said softly. "No," she replied. "We did." When they stepped outside, the afternoon sun was warm on their faces. The world felt larger somehow, freer. They stood at the top of the steps, uncertain of what would come next, yet knowing it would be better than what they had left behind. Martha looked toward the horizon, feeling something she had not felt in a long time. Possibility. A small breeze brushed past her cheek, carrying the scent of pine and open sky. For the first time since she had entered Seaver's house, she felt truly alive. And as she walked down the steps with the others beside her, she understood that some fights were worth waging at any age, because dignity was not something that could be taken quietly, and truth was not something that could be buried under upholstery or hidden behind locked doors. They had been watched. They had been recorded. They had been underestimated. But in the end, they had won. And Martha, with her steady steps and newly awakened strength, knew that she would never again let anyone silence her. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories ahead. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories shouldn't stay hidden.